Welcome to Something to Talk About from the Bainbridge Island Senior Community Center. Something to Talk About is sponsored by Fieldstone Memory Care of Bainbridge Island, which offers memory care right now, and will soon be adding assisted living and independent living. They are open to tours. Here's the phone number to call if you'd like to take a look at their lovely campus up on Rolling Bay, 360-689-4314. Also, I want to acknowledge that we are meeting on the ancestral homelands of the Coast Salish people, specifically the Suquamish tribe, the people of the clear salt water who have cared for these lands and waters since time immemorial. We are grateful for their hospitality and we honor them. And thank you all for joining us as we continue our discussion of Stamped, the racism, anti-racism, and you, the remix of Stamped from the Beginning, written by Jason Reynolds with inspiration and help from the writer of Stamped from the Beginning, Ibram Kendi. And Anne Lovejoy and I have been facilitating these talks. And Anne, I'll just hand it over to you to get us started.
Thanks, Reed, and thanks everybody for showing up. And I hope you find these conversations as thoughtful and enriching and stimulating as we all have so far. A few ground rules before we get going. I think one good thing to think about in any situation where we're having a conversation is be curious and listen to understand. Be respectful, no crosstalk or interrupting. That's really difficult for some of us, including me, and share the air. If you've made your point, maybe leave some space for someone else to make their point and try to be mindful of not taking more than maybe 2 to possibly 3 minutes tops for a remark, because there's quite a few of us. We facilitators will be timekeepers if necessary, but otherwise we can all just jump right in. And as always, I just want to check in and say, has everybody here read the book or listened to the audio book, or at least looked at the cover of the book, anything of those lines? All right. I feel like we're just getting to the place now in section 4 where we're starting to move to the now, where a lot of what we're looking at and talking about this section is what many of us grew up with, watching happen, or it's in family memory, if nothing else. And that, I think, is really an important thing to think about in terms of bringing everything that's in this book to today, bringing it into our lives, how it plays out and how we are affected still by those things. I would love to hear anybody's thoughts about, we talked about a little bit about media representation of especially Black people, but also people of color in the last session, but in section 3, but in section 4, there's kind of another jump to talk about the birth of the nation and the planet of the apes, Tarzan, stuff like that. So I was really curious to hear what people think about where do we still see echoes of that legacy, or what's different about the way media portrays people of color now. Anybody want to jump in on that? Hey, Jana.
I'll jump in.
Thanks.
I was on a very long flight and watched movie after movie after movie recently. And I watched a film called Ticket to Paradise about a woman who goes to Bali on vacation and ends up marrying a guy there. And, you know, I don't know what research was done, but I mean, this wedding ceremony had, you know, a dozen different unusual customs, and it felt very, it felt very made for Hollywood and stereotypical, and it was kind of shocking to me that this film was made in this day and age. So there's that on the one hand, but I'm also seeing lots more people of color represented in advertisements and that kind of thing. And, you know, it's there's still an othering going on, but, you know, and then the question came up to me in my mind is, well, does showing, you know, a Black person in a luxury spa in this ad I'm watching on my little screen on the airplane, does that make a difference? Curious about that.
Yeah, I feel like it's you know, our messaging, our media is very complicated. We get a lot of mixed messages coming out of our television and our music and all that stuff. It seems like and in the book there's some discussion of sort of the idea of relegating Black actors or comedians or musicians as sort of being entertainers rather than full participants in society. And I feel like that's a challenge that you know that is sort of persistent even to this day. We're more as a culture more willing to accept somebody of color if they're in sort of an entertainment or athletic role. And I think that's so to me, the idea of those advertisements don't hurt. It's useful, but it's only a step. Looks like Akuye, you have your hand up.
Yes, Rita, I'm so grateful that you brought that up because we're talking about not just cultural, but racial memory. When we talk about the history and the long history of African Americans and how African Americans were, especially the enslaved African Americans to this nation, was used for those type of what I would call practices. And so as we begin to talk about the social, the racial, the cultural memories of how we move away from those things that was perpetuated and instilled in our society as a whole, the nation, is very important that we have these type of conversations as we move forward, because until we're able to process them in a historical content as well as social and emotional and racial, I think that is the process of us healing forward from the atrocities that was perpetuated in this nation for so many years. So thank you again for bringing up, you know, that history and what that history still continues perpetuate in a lot of ways.
Yeah, I feel as though to some degree, maybe not even to some degree, to a major degree, the sort of outrageous protests against President Obama was because of his participating as a fully intellectual government official, not, you know, sort of in a lane that was, I mean, basically our president. And I think that's, you know, it's wonderful that happened, but the reaction that we've seen shows that how much work we have to do, how far we have yet to go. Anyone else have a idea about media and Black representation? Barbara.
Well, it's not about Black representation, but it's about more diversity, which is there's a new series on TV And Hilary Swank is like the lead character, but she's a reporter in Alaska. And there's an indigenous reporter that she's working with, and they're trying to make sure that she doesn't run over, or domineer too much in their collaboration. But they're covering really important stories like missing and murdered indigenous women, and you never see that on TV. So I appreciate that they have both diversity in cast, and they're looking at storylines that are significant and meaningful.
Want to jump in here?
Yeah. Oh, my name is John Kidd. I haven't been in this group before, so excuse me. But I guess speaking personally, I find that the media seems to be a filtration system, and it lets through images and promotes images that reinforce the media. So we consequently have more appearances of Black faces, but then oftentimes the appearances in commercials and a variety of medias are sanitized or made in a fashion that is more saleable, I suppose, and that really concerns me. It concerns me that we don't have adequate awards and Oscars or even nominations. That Viola Davis did a wonderful job as a warrior king, and all of these other pictures and media. So I guess what I find is that my white media lets in images of minority communities that are satisfactory and safe for the white community, which is what a classic colonial culture does. And then it turns around and it excludes. But it also excludes even more by way of gender. And still, women are still significantly victimized and significantly threatened in many situations in terms of public safety. And so you kind of have a double whammy within the female community of minority communities. So that's all.
I think it's interesting too that in just today, all of a sudden, there's a big movement on the right-leaning media to frame the way that things are being handled in that little Ohio town where the train went over and spilled all kinds of toxic things, that nobody in the woke Biden administration cares about them because they're just poor white people. And it's like those lefty liberals only care about Black people. And I just thought, well, that was so interesting because it's like taking advantage of every possible way to make sure that any attempt at real progressive thought is framed as performative or almost a joke, really. It's fascinating to me. It's the media manipulation has never been easier. And we can see it sort of playing out even like day by day, right? How these stories get switched around, right?
Yeah. I was talking before we started about Scott Adams, the creator of the Dilbert cartoon, who's been now pulled from a lot of newspapers after he had a YouTube rant in which he described Black people as a hate group, and was using sort of specious polling to try to support the idea. And he'd made comments before, but this was sort of even for him over the top. And so many newspapers pulled his column, which shows sort of the I don't know if the trench warfare, the idea that we're kind of in a battle over woke or awakened, what used to be called, raised consciousness, as somehow being bad, or not that raised consciousness after all at all. And I think that's where it gets very hard. It gets really hard to argue in this kind of a situation. In fact, what you find it really difficult to find common ground. Akuye.
Yes, Reed, again, I just wanted to thank you for calling in warfare. We come from a military history in our family. We've all served our nation in the military, all branches. And one of the things that we have to understand, you know, propaganda in media is a form of warfare. And if we don't understand how those mediums can be used, whether it's during war, you know, military warfare or social warfare, they are real. And so we have to begin to understand how propaganda, social media can perpetuate these harms as warfare. They are warfare practices. And if we come from those lenses and recognize how propaganda and how media is being used to perpetuate hate and harm and all these things, then we can begin to have a clear conversation about how social media and newspaper and all of these different forms are being used at this and at such a time as this in our history. And so that's a wonderful point that you brought to the forefront. But let's conversation about these types of warfare, because they are.
Thanks, Akuye. Laura, you have your hand up.
Thanks, Reed. I've been thinking about media also, and I think the vast majority, like you all are saying, it's biased and really frustrating. However, I'm also noticing that there's some stronger voices coming out that I'm noticing more often. And one of those is in the Seattle Times. Her name is Naomi Ishizaka, and she published an article today called "When Do the Privileged Feel Like Victims When Others Are Seeking Equity?" And I thought that was so interesting. It has a really, so if you guys want to look for that one, I think it's a really good explanation of what she's finding as she's writing more stories about equity, the pushback and the responses that she's getting. And the angriest ones are from those with the most privilege. And I just find that interesting. And she also, I would say, well, because we're part of this BI Reads for Justice group, the number of books that are coming out that I think really describe in such a much better way what has happened historically in many different ways. And one book that's kind of on my list right now is The Sum of Us. What racism costs everyone and how we can prosper together. I think there's this idea of a zero-sum society that if we start to get equity, someone's going to lose. And I think that's such a fallacy, and I'm looking to learn more about that. How can we really, as a community on Bainbridge Island, create a situation where we all benefit? And I think there's just so much room there to learn more and to work together.
Oh, John here again. I'm really interested in the idea of bias and wondering if it's possible to suggest that the bias has perhaps more structure, that right now we're in an era of sort of intellectual Jim Crow, where we're seeking to exclude ideas, exclude books, exclude AP Black Studies curriculum in a fashion that we used to exclude individuals from holding office, being able to buy real estate, and et cetera. And that the anger dynamic that we see in the Dilbert author is very similar to the fear dynamic within various different legislators, which causes them to demonize all of these various activities. And, I did some work in the critical legal studies area, and to see that being outlawed by people that have never really looked at it, and it doesn't have any content that I've found that's remotely racial, but the engine of our sort of intellectual Jim Crow is so strong that it manages to demonize something and get it excluded from discussion without even reading it in the first place.
We've seen too, the whole big push in the last few decades to kind of weaponize science. And I think it's that thing, wasn't it Daniel Moynihan again, who said, Senator, you're entitled to your own opinions, but you're not entitled to your own facts. And yet we seem to have weaponized facts too. And I think that's another aspect of that warfare Akuye was talking about, that everybody is equally free to twist and distort in whatever manner they feel will be the most destructive. That's really troubling to me.
Yeah, John's mention of Jim Crow, that was in fact, those laws were put in effect basically in the same sort of effort to try to reverse Lincoln's opportunity to allow Black people to vote and participate fully. And so this Jim Crow reaction is the same one today in a way. And that's both scary, and it means that we have an obligation to try to forcibly, visibly react, which is why, I was happy to see those newspapers pull the Dilbert columns, because it's like, no, this is not appropriate conversation. I wonder, another question that we were going to raise today is in 2022, the NAACP held its 113th convention with the theme, Our Community is Power. In 2023, activities have already included the People's Rally for Student Debt Cancellation and Civil Rights Advocacy Training. What do we think after hearing about W.E.B. Du Bois in last week and this, about what he might think if he were to be active in the NAACP today? I know that one of the things that was brought up earlier in Stamped was that the NAACP's origins were assimilationist or accommodationists, and that when Marcus Garvey walked into the office, he only saw white people working there. It seems to me as though the organization has certainly, in many ways, changed over the years. Your thoughts about that?
One thing you can definitely see if you look on the NAACP website is that they've embraced intersectionality and are really opening themselves to supporting, there's a big program on canceling student debt. There's another one on SCOTUS, how to make sure that your elected officials know what you feel about the way that the Supreme Court is being manipulated right now. Really considering changes of how people are elected to the Supreme Court and whether it should really be lifetime terms. And also the training for how to deal with all kinds of situations, but specifically they were talking about advocacy, civil rights advocacy training, but also training to help. They were reaching out to trans people, to the queer community. It's embracing women's rights. It's much bigger and broader and more generous than it was in that first little office when W.E.B. Du Bois walked in and saw a bunch of white guys. So I think that is really impressive, and that says a lot about the way these counter movements are bumping into each other today.
Yeah, I think what you're mentioning about intersectionality, which is a word you brought up a few times here, the idea that there are overlapping interests. And one of the things that's come out in Stamped is that when racists are trying to stop anti-racism, they try to divide people of different racial communities by economics or judgment to try to break up the intersectionality, to try to make it so that the idea that we have as people with multiple backgrounds, very similar needs, desires, and goals. And I don't, anybody have any examples of how there are efforts at that attempt to counter intersectionality today? You seeing that in the schools or our public discussions?
Oh, it's working.
It's on.
Yeah.
How it's, playing out.
Like, I mean, are you seeing where, for example, people are trying to separate out discussions about transgender people as a way to kind of avoid people finding common cause? Does that make sense, John? Is it too vague?
Yeah, I think so. I'm just remembering doing some work with William Barber and the way he would set up his groups in South Carolina, North Carolina, is he'd put together mixed race groups whereby people in the groups would be presenting the view of a race other than they were. So white folks would have to be presenting to black folks the black view and vice versa. But then that led to the sense that we're all carrying different parts of each other. Just as we have an extremely complex genetic code that doesn't sort at all racially, there's this very complex socio-political code that we've internalized that has horrible stereotypes based on all of these things, and that they link together in fashion of intersectionality. And Kimberly Crenshaw, who coined the term, is another person whose writings are now being actively rejected in Florida and a couple of other states. So it's really interesting that it appears we have this unconscious immune system that causes many people to almost to reject certain domains of difficulty and simply push them away without allowing them to be brought into their consciousness or their community.
Rita, you have your hand up.
I was going to say, when you keep people separated, they're not as strong. So when people can unite, they are much stronger. And through the history, we have seen, whether it's keeping, not giving women certain rights to vote or to do certain things, to keep them not powerful. And same thing with the queer community or anything else. So I think that if we realize that it's more than just racial, that if we can come together and stay together and include all kinds of people, we are so much stronger. And so I think that going forward, that's going to be really important to move this country forward into being very, very inclusive. They talk about being inclusive all the time, but it's not always very inclusive. It's very separated.
Thank you, Rita. Anne?
Well, the thing that comes to me with intersectionality is the use of fear mongering and splitting of impoverished groups. So impoverished whites against impoverished blacks or other, groups. And this is used to basically for the purpose of supporting the political goals of one person or another, and is not productive. But it's to me, there's so much commonality among people who are struggling at the margins, and they are being used to support political goals of an individual rather than any kind of benefit to society.
Thank you for that. You mentioned Reverend Barber, and he has been very active, did a whole series on Moral Mondays, and I think he's very he's currently involved in what's the Rejuvenated Poor People's Campaign, which echoes Reverend Martin Luther King Jr. But I feel as though the campaign, which has involved lots of activity and lots of conferences and people all over the country getting involved, gets hardly any press coverage. It's really hard to follow it in the major media, and I wonder if anybody would like to comment on that, on what it takes to get the attention of these kinds of unity movements when things like the outrageous behavior of Scott Adams or something like that gets coverage all over the place.
I think one thing's pretty clear that, humans have always liked bread and circuses, right? It's like we do like sensational trivia and we are easily distractible and we love to be distracted. I think that's partly why so much of the political machinations work so well, because it's very much in big corporate interests to keep people divided and to keep people afraid, worried, anxious, because frightened people are much easier to herd and easier to divide. And divided, we fall, right? So I think being aware that we're being manipulated can be really helpful. Martha, did you want to add to that?
Well, I do agree with divided we fall and the like. But when I hear that at first, I'm at a loss because I thought, well, I'm not going to follow like that. That's not how my mind works, speaking for myself, and not thinking, well, other people do follow like they're saying. But I thought, how many people really do? So, just a few little thoughts.
I think one thing that is the case here is that we can be, as you said, Anne, distracted. But it isn't a matter of whether whether we can whether we have the mind to do it or not. It's sort of like the idea of these scams where most of the time we're on our best game, but then one of these little scams will come across and ask for our password, and oops, there we went, right down the rabbit hole. Rita, you have something to add?
I was going to say, one of the things that I think we forget about sometimes too is how important education is, not just for us, but for starting young and critical thinking skills for young people, for college people. And I think sometimes, we get to this thing where they're teaching to the test so that they can get a grade so they can get into, some college that they want. But there's no underlying way for them to have, not everyone, but I think it's so important to be able to teach critical thinking skills to people when they're young, when they're starting in preschool, to be able to have that. And the other thing is when you don't have that, and when you have people who are struggling every day just to have housing and to have food and thinking about their children being safe, that's what you're thinking about. And so a lot of times the bigger things that are going on around you, even though they are important, they don't come across your mind because you're just trying to keep yourself afloat. And there's a lot of people in this country that is the case. It's not that they aren't interested and they don't want to not be, thinking about higher things and, how to keep our country from being so anti-racist, or from being so racist, but people are just trying to get by. And I think that sometimes we forget that there are a lot of people that are just trying to get by. And so that also keeps us divided.
Yeah, and that's that's how we keep the economy strong, right? There could be some ulterior motives there.
I just wanted to indict myself a little bit, but I'm a person who's comfortable and educated and everything else, and I live on an island here with, as you do, with many comfortable and educated people. But in attending the recent movie series that was very well advertised, it got, I think, much better coverage than Barbara did, where they had Black Klansmen and Malcolm X, et cetera. There were rarely more than 4 people in an audience that could have held 100. And that's here. So part of me wants to raise an issue that I share blame in. How is it that a very well-educated, liberal, affluent community fails to be drawn to a well-advertised, well-curated, and well-reviewed movie series that tries to get into the guts of racism with a series of Spike Lee movies? I'm part of the problem.
Well, you were there.
Yeah. Well, just for them.
You attended.
But is there something about liberal intellectual privilege structure that is married to apathy?
Sure, we like to be comfortable. It's
Yeah.
equilibrium. The human condition seeks equilibrium, and we want to be comfortable if we can. As Rita says, everybody's trying to get by, but once we're getting by, we want to stay getting by. And it's difficult to make ourselves really be willing to be uncomfortable. And the whole basis of all this equity work is being willing to be uncomfortable. And that is hard for some of us all the time, and it's hard for all of us some of the time, right? One thing we've really seen here is like in the COVID years when we were all on lockdown, a lot of people were not outside getting entertained or doing stuff, and they were turning to their devices, and we saw awful things. I think for many, many people in this country, watching George Floyd be killed was an absolute turning point. And for a couple of years, there was so much interest. We could run, and we did run a lot of programs about racism, about injustice, about social justice action work we could do, about all kinds of things, and got strong participation. And then as we got able to get out more and do more, it kind of dwindled right here in beautiful Bubble Bainbridge. Because if we were able to do our more normal things, we wanted to, and perfectly human and perfectly reasonable. But I think having the appetite for discomfort, having the appetite for looking at our own racism, for looking at our own brokenness, I think that's not easy for humans. Oh, clearly it's not. And part of the work for all of us is to say, I really do need to open myself up to learn. And I really do need to open myself up to hear more things that might not be very comfortable to listen to. But that's the work.
Mm-hmm.
Is it possible to suggest that there's comfort in facing injustice, comfort in righting wrongs, and that you see it in family systems and see it in neighborhoods? So on the other hand, I feel less uncomfortable by facing racism and as much as I can and trying to experience the discomfort of going through the curriculum. But then as a result of that, I feel more comfortable as a responsible human being.
No, it's not. And the thing is, I grew up in New England, and there's that whole if you can, you must.
Yeah.
Suck it up and do it. And I never got over it. But I think there's something in that. It's very old fashioned and it's kind of limited and pretty rigid, but it does create, one of the things that it creates is volunteers, people who show up to help, right? And we're really seeing in many of the things I'm involved with are volunteer based, and many of them are dwindling and many of them are graying out, right? We're getting older because younger people, of course they're busy, but I was busy and I was still volunteering. I'm saying our generation was really raised up in that. And I think, how do we help people get there? understand what you're saying, John, that there really is a benefit to being, for volunteering, for doing the work, for showing up for social justice stuff. It's actually very satisfying and rewarding. Maybe it doesn't look like it. Maybe we need to smile more.
Oh, that's the beloved community that Thurman talks about.
Yeah, exactly.
Barbara,
I wanted to sort of piggyback off of John's comment, because I want to praise BEMA for the diversity of the programs and events that they offer. And I didn't go to the movies. I didn't, if I don't write it down when I get the email, it's gone. But I did go to, they had a wonderful event on Martin Luther King Jr. Day, really celebrating and highlighting the talents of many of the Black performers of all ages. It was a really joyful experience. So it wasn't like, oh, I need to go and do this work. It was like, thank you for letting me, be present here. And the same thing last Friday night, it was cold and I had the conversation with myself, but oh, it'd be so nice to stay inside. And I thought, no, these people are coming to the island and they're sharing, their culture with us, and it would be rude of me not to go. And I had a fantastic time. So it isn't just, make yourself go because it's the right thing to do. Make yourself go because it's a gift to yourself and it's a wonderful way to learn.
thank you for
That's
that.
all.
And I do think that that's true of a lot of volunteer activities of all kinds, in addition to attending. Showing up often is a reward that you don't expect. Jenna, you were earlier saying, kind of had your hand up there. Is there something you had a thought that you wanted to share?
Yeah, a couple thoughts. Number one, I think that looking at one's own racism and prejudices is painful, but doing it in a supportive community is transformational. And that's the kind of community that I have found doing this work on Bainbridge Island, moving here and being welcomed, by Anne and Reed at the community center, and also by Akuye, many of the organizations and initiatives that she's involved in. This is a place where we can learn and grow together. And it really is, we all make mistakes all the time with words, thoughts, attitudes, actions, and, being brought up to speed and then being pushed to carry on. That's how you do it, right? Sorry, and let's keep going. So that's the kind of community I found here. The thing I wanted to bring up, and I see that Akuye also has her hand up, but just kind of, I could imagine some people reading Stamped and kind of rolling their eyes at the idea that, wait, so Tarzan was racist, and, Rocky and Sylvester Stallone, that's a story about racism. Wait a minute. And I wonder if folks in this group would want to comment on how someone would say, how you would respond to someone saying, oh, that's just an overreaction, or, people didn't mean to, be racist in doing that. And how do we hear that kind of feedback or that kind of attitude, and how do we respond to that kind of attitude? That's one thing I'm curious about.
Yeah, that is a very good point. I think I would love to talk a little more about that. I will hand the mic though to Kuye, and if others have thoughts about that, we'll get back to that.
Great.
Kuye, could you unmute?
Hello, can you hear me now?
Yep.
All right. You know what, Jana, and Reed and the senior center and BMA and our community as a whole, I'm so grateful, and I can say that I'm so grateful that our community has come in a way that is very welcoming and unifying about some hard issues, and is really modeling for other communities as well as for our county that these issues are not going away. What will we do to come together in a collective, collaborative way to address some of these hard issues that need to be addressed and is very, what I would say, very detrimental to the health being of all of our communities. You know, we talk about the work of undoing institutionalized racism, but very few put hands to task to be able to ask those hard questions, to be able to review the books, to be able to come together and celebrate one another, to be able to sit down and say, let's look at this. You know, why are we still struggling, you know, all this time, you know, on these issues, and what's at the root of it? To be able to process like that, to me, is transformational work. And so I commend, you know, all of us, even here on taking this time today out of your day just to say, okay, let's talk about STAMP. Let's talk about some of these things, you know, that is really something that we can no longer turn a blind eye to, but how do we begin to move forward to address them? And so I just wanted to thank Jana and Reed and Ann and the team and the community members that have really been intentional about stepping into addressing some of these issues. And so just wanted to say thank you all, and
Well, thank you, Akuye, for being such a great inspiration and opening the door and saying, come on, you want to get in and talk about this? That's who I'd like to thank as well.
Oh.
Anita.
Yeah, I just wanted to comment I was just listening to the audio stamped this morning. And one of the things that I brought to my attention was back when schools were desegregated, it was Black students that were bused to white schools. And apparently no white students were bused to Black schools. And I hadn't really thought about that before, but again, it seemed like sort of this, what's the term? Just, you know, trying to make Black students, again, we'll make them like white students, you know. It is just so ingrained in our culture, in our country. So I just wanted to point that out.
Yep. Assimilation is the term you're thinking of that they're using here as racist, assimilationists, and anti-racist. Rita.
Well, I was going to say too, the other thing, when you're busing students, taking Black students out of their neighborhoods, it breaks up the neighborhoods, and it's hard. It breaks up family structures. It takes a lot of time, so they're not in their neighborhoods. And I don't think we think about that sometimes. But it really, it also breaks up the neighborhoods, and it just is, it's really difficult. It's really difficult. So that's just one other thing to think about.
Thank you. Ann?
Yeah, so we think about education and how important it is. One of the problems when we're taking Black students to the better white schools, part of the problem is how we pay for education using local taxes. And I think that if we could work on shifting some of that, we might benefit and might be able to make actual progress in every community.
Yeah, I know that the idea of,
Need help?
yes, Akuye.
Oh, no, I'm sorry. Go ahead.
Um, the idea of local control of schools, is, foundational in the country. And one of the things that talking about these things makes me think is that maybe there was a reason for that is not what I had always thought. In other words, maybe that kind of a local control is more about white control. And one of the ways that that's affected me, you were talking earlier about the Tarzan series, Jana, and I was thinking about how one of the things that reading this book has done for me is to consciously think, if I were not white and I were reading books that put people that shared the color of my skin in the same sort of roles over and over again, wouldn't I notice that? So, that would be one way that I might think about starting to approach it. The idea of the smart, studious Asian student in every story, right? Or the in the Tarzan stories about how the white warrior who comes to Africa and protects the white woman from the less powerful or less more dangerous Africans. It seems to me like that. If you look at it and think yes, it's a story, but it's a story with certain characters playing certain roles. Jake, I see you've unmuted. Do you have a comment here?
I do. Let me lower my hand. I was school reform coordinator and desegregation coordinator for a visual and performing arts middle school in San Jose, California. And we were court ordered from a segregation case that started in 1969. And then it took years to finally resolve it, but we developed a magnet school program in San Jose. So it was voluntary busing, and kids moved in both directions. We had kids from the country club school. San Jose Unified School District is like a long finger. The country club school was in the south end. The primarily Latino lower income families were in the north. And it took 3 years, but in 3 years, we established 50% voluntary students coming to this middle school in the south of San Jose, and 50% white kids moved out elsewhere, primarily white students. And granted, it does cause some discomfort on both ends to make those changes. It does change things in the neighborhood. It does change things in the family. And the value and the payoff given time and support far outweighs the discomfort that it takes in the beginning. And this is such a difficult thing for me to talk about because it's so dear to my heart. I can't listen casually to it, but I know it's hard to put yourself in another position. Just look at us as a group, who we are. And we are comfortable, for the most part, on Bainbridge, very comfortable white people. But it's a difficult question. It's not something that's easy to do, but it has to do with educating not just the kids, educating the families, not giving up, going to the hard places, having the hard conversations, and just keep on keeping on. And here it is, 2023. I started doing this work in the early 70s. We're still doing it, but so much of what makes the change is the one-on-one conversations. Go see the Spike Lee movie. I mean, come on, and take a friend. Keep having the conversations, and the one-on-one conversations are the most important. Just like children, you continue to talk. You don't have to be judgmental. You continue to share and talk. and know that the information is there. Let people process it in the privacy of their own home, but keep putting the information out there and keep putting yourself out, because I'm still learning. I am definitely still learning. That's why Ed and he's done the same kind of work through the UC California system in Santa Cruz in California. And we just keep on doing it. You can't learn enough. And it's not just about race, it's about all kinds of things. But I don't know what else to say. If I had a magic answer, we wouldn't be having this conversation today. That's it.
Well, thank you very much. Yes, I think that idea that there's no magic answer and we have to just keep working. And as Anne was saying earlier, show up ourselves and invite others, as you were saying, to show up with us.
Yep. And talk to the kiddos.
It's like, there's no magic answer, but perhaps the magic is in our commitment. How each of us,
There you go.
fathom that sense of being in it for the rest of our lives, as long as we can breathe, day by day, doing exactly what we can, and knowing that that commitment is something that we share. And that may be a part of the central fabric of why we're here.